Welcome to the Soil and Roots podcast, digging beneath the surface to uncover the hidden ideas that form us, the church, and the culture. I'm Brian Fisher. This is episode 7, Take My Breath Away, and it's our first bonus episode. Soil and Roots is an organization dedicated to cultivating deep discipleship in community, and this podcast is a primary outreach of that effort. The podcast is designed to gently lead us into a deeper and deeper understanding of Jesus and his story, ourselves and our stories, and how our hearts are formed more and more by his ideas. The episodes are designed to be listened to in order. But every so often we slow down and catch our breath and just review and marinate in what we've explored so far. We take an occasional pit stop. Bonus episodes are great to come back to as you progress if you want a quick refresher. These pit stops are helpful because we're exploring discipleship, spiritual formation, our hearts, and even culture in ways that we're probably not used to. We're using terms and words that may not be familiar, and to put it bluntly, we're kind of looking at reality in a different light. And it takes a while for our hearts and minds to get used to all of this reframing. We're in the middle of season 1, and this group of 13 episodes is designed to help us basically get our feet wet in what we call deep discipleship. So today, let's poke around in what we've explored so far, and then I'm going to tee up one or two things that are on the horizon. The problem we're working to solve is what Dallas Willard called the great omission, the lack of genuine disciple-making in the West. Willard saw it as a primary challenge for the church. I think its impact is even more comprehensive. The great omission is at the heart of the ongoing decay and challenges in all of Western culture. The lack of disciple-making is causing widespread damage and carnage in all 7 mountains of culture, including the family and the church. Of all the pastors and church leaders I've networked with over the years, I have yet to spend time with one who thinks that discipleship is going great. No one has yet to say, well, our church is just crushing it with discipleship. We're producing more and more people who do the things Jesus did and love like he loves. In fact, our church members are regularly confused with Jesus and the early disciples. Now, one of the causes of the great omission is a lack of clarity about what a disciple actually is. So, for our purposes, we've clearly defined it. A disciple is an apprentice of Jesus for the purpose of becoming more like him. I've asked dozens of people what their definition of discipleship is, and most people say a disciple is someone who follows Jesus. That's correct, but the definition isn't complete unless we define the purpose of following Jesus. We follow him so that our character becomes more like his. Discipleship is character formation, or heart formation, or what we call spiritual formation. We apprentice with Jesus so that we learn to do what he does. We live like he lived. We love like he loves. We desire what he desires. Our ideas become formed into his ideas. That purpose statement alone challenges some of our assumptions. Do we go to a church service expecting we'll leave knowing more about Jesus, or that we'll leave being more like Jesus? Do we attend our weekly Bible studies to just learn more about the Bible, or so that we become more like the author of the Bible? Do we seek emotional worship environments so that we simply experience Jesus, or that those experiences form us to become more like Jesus? Worship experiences, biblical doctrine, studying the Bible, worldview courses, apologetics, church services are all fantastic things, provided they're forming us in the very depths of who we are. So for a Christian, this question becomes pretty critical. Do I think, act, relate, speak, listen, desire, give, and love more like Jesus now than I did 5 years ago? If not, why not? Am I becoming more like Jesus, or am I an educated convert? Most people who have been around Christian culture for any length of time can sort of buy into this way of framing discipleship as spiritual formation. What is most likely new to us is where we headed next, to the world of ideas. We experience spiritual formation as the ideas in our hearts transform from dark ideas to light ideas. Wait, what? I don't recall hearing anything about ideas in Sunday school or my Bible study. Well, we're digging way beneath the surface here into how a human heart is formed and how we operate and function in the world. An idea is a fundamental assumption. It's a concept or principle in which our hearts are rooted, but we're typically not aware of them. And an idea is not so much an intellectual conclusion as it is an experienced reality. So if we find ourselves perpetually anxious about something and our brains keep telling us that we shouldn't be anxious, there's no real reason to be anxious, the Bible tells us we shouldn't be anxious, we're experiencing a disconnect between our idea and our belief. Our brains know we shouldn't be anxious, but our hearts are experiencing a different reality. It has a different idea. Perhaps you've struggled to emotionally connect with God as your Father. You know He's your Father, but you rarely feel like He's your Father. You appreciate Him, you acknowledge Him, you worship Him, but you find it difficult to relate to Him. You don't experience Him as a loving, caring, kind, gentle Father. Well, your theology is fine, though your challenge may not be theological. It may be your story, which is formed by ideas. If you grew up in a home where your primary caregivers had a deep desire to know you, to be with you, and to know you simply because you were you may have little trouble experiencing God as your Father. However, if your caregivers exploited you to perform for them, provided for you but were emotionally distant, or were so wrapped up in their own problems that they didn't have time for you, your heart was formed in a different set of ideas, a set of experienced realities that may well make it difficult for you to relate to God now. This is why understanding our past is so vital for our spiritual formation in the future. These ideas are pretty mysterious, and because we live in a society so focused on what's visible and rational, they come across as a bit odd. However, if we can get into the habit of identifying them in culture, in our communities, in our churches, and certainly in our hearts, and if we embrace how ideas are formed and transformed, it really is amazing. I sound like a used car salesman, but it may well change your life. Why? Because if we want to become more like Jesus, we begin to understand that Jesus lived and operated in the realm of ideas and desires. He was constantly confronting and reframing ideas in the culture and ideas in human hearts. If we read Matthew 5-7, the Sermon on the Mount, we find that he is systematically uncovering cultural, political, and social ideas, assumptions, and principles, and replacing them with his ideas. Have you ever wondered why Jesus rarely directly answered a question that was asked of him? Because he had an uncanny ability to discern the ideas and desires of the heart of the questioner, and he routinely skipped the small talk, the surface questions, to dig into the bedrock of someone's heart. The rich young ruler, the woman at the well, many of his interactions with the Pharisees. Jesus was constantly picking apart religious rituals, legalisms, political ideals, social assumptions, and personal prejudices in order to uncover the roots of people's hearts. Once we get our arms around these ideas and go back and read the Gospels and Acts, it's just whoa. Jesus didn't just uncover and teach ideas, he lived them. He invited others to experience them. One way to look at the cross and resurrection is the most cosmic transformation of ideas in the history of the universe. Those events have upended and transformed more personal and cultural ideas than anything else since time began. Thinking about it should take our breath away. We've described this journey into ideas and desires in our hearts as deep discipleship. At Soil and Roots, we talk about digging beneath the surface. A friend of mine refers to it as being awake or attuned. We're attuned to God's heart, and we're attuned to our own. We're awake to the ideas driving culture. We're awake to the ideas powering ourselves and those around us. Last episode, we described deep discipleship as stages 4, 5, and 6 of this critical journey, along with the wall, those inevitable times in our lives where things just start to fall apart. In fact, many, if not most people, don't ever become aware of ideas in their hearts, or the hearts around them, or in the church or culture. We may have this vague sense of being disconnected from God and others and ourselves, and we may have this feeling that there really should be more to the Christian life, but we're too busy with the innumerable distractions available to us today, including all of the distractions at church. Normally, we don't dive into the deep end of discipleship until we're faced with some kind of wall, a theological challenge, an illness, an accident, a crisis, betrayal, a divorce, a burnout, a breakdown of some sort. Sometimes we just wake up and realize we've been doing church for years, but it doesn't seem to have any meaningful impact on us or the world around us. Why are we here again? We just check the box and go back to being numb. And most churches are only aware of or concerned about stages 1, 2, and 3, so we're producing people who are aware of God and learning about Him and serving Him. But if the process of becoming more like Jesus involves the depths of the wall in stages 4, 5, and 6, and we don't even know those exist, that might provide some explanation for why so many of us get stuck in the shallow waters of spiritual formation. As we began to wade into deeper waters, we started to explore a few examples of common ideas to see if what our hearts embrace actually aligns with biblical reality. We've explored an idea of the gospel. Did Jesus come only to save me from sins and will one day whisk me away to some disconnected home in the clouds? Or is the gospel far more comprehensive than just a state of my soul? Perhaps He's up to something much bigger and something much more connected. This relates to another idea, an idea of expectation. Are we expecting to escape a bad body and a bad earth and take as many people as possible with us? Or should we expect something else? Should we expect only rescue and relief? Or do restoration, redemption, and recreation play a part in our expectation? This one idea has a profound influence on just about everything we do. We've discussed that many people embrace confusing ideas of anthropology, what it means to be human. We're primarily creatures of desire. We're lovers. We are embodied souls. We are integrated beings living in an integrated world. As much as we constantly try, we can't engage our body, mind, or spirit and not have all three dimensions be impacted. And though we try very hard to disintegrate ourselves and others, that's never a good idea. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of categories of ideas, and our hearts are filled with at least hundreds of them about all sorts of things: origin, time, unity, money, expectation, truth, fairness, freedom, beauty. Okay, so there's a quick review of where we are so far. Now let's just tee up a few things we'll be exploring as we move ahead. There are some categories of ideas that we'll come back to time and again on Soil and Roots. It's because there are some ideas that actually go deeper than others. They're fundamental. So, new term alert, we call these vital categories the 6 core ideas. And they are ideas of identity, value, anthropology, power, purpose, and love. Ideas of identity. Who am I? Ideas of value. What am I worth? Ideas of anthropology. What am I? Ideas of power. What authority do I have? Ideas of purpose. Why am I here? Ideas of love. What or whom do I desire? These critical foundational ideas about ourselves and the world around us are primarily formed in our earliest years through our relationship with our primary caregivers, typically called our family of origin. We cannot overstate just how powerful those first few years of our lives are in terms of our initial and ongoing spiritual formation. Just like the bones and muscles of a little baby are soft and malleable in her first few years of life, her heart is soft and malleable at that age. Just like our bodies go through tremendous growth and change in the first few years of our lives, our hearts go through tremendous growth and change in our first few years. This is why most of the 7 mountains of culture are extremely aggressive about reaching and influencing young children. And this is why understanding our past is so important for how we're formed in the future. If our first few years are so important in our spiritual formation, it's appropriate to ask how these core ideas were formed in our spirits. Is it primarily through verbal instruction? Is a little toddler's heart primarily formed by her parents giving her verbal or written information? Probably not. Baby doesn't understand verbal instructions for the first few months of her life and doesn't have the capacity for rational, cohesive thinking for a while longer. So how are her initial ideas of identity, value, anthropology, power, purpose, and love formed? All right, another new term alert. It's through what we call the 5 key elements of formation: time, habit, intimacy, community, and instruction. So let's look at time. How much time does a baby or toddler spend with her primary caregivers? In a healthy situation, she spends enormous amounts of time with them. She's experiencing the gift of presence. Her parents are present with her. They're with her. It goes back to the concept of withness that we've explored already. Habit. What habits are her caregivers instilling in her even at a very young age? What rituals or traditions or repetitive behaviors? Sleeping, eating, playing, being held, just looking into the eyes of her mom or dad. In healthy situations, babies and toddlers are introduced to many great habits and life-giving interactions between themselves. Intimacy, things like touch, vocal tone, emotional closeness, presence. A baby in a loving home constantly and willingly experiences intimacy, physical, emotional, and spiritual intimacy. Her caregivers are constantly giving themselves to the child. They are sharing themselves with their child. Okay, community. In a healthy setting, the child is constantly in relationship with the same group of predictable people, her caregivers and her siblings, perhaps extended family or close friends. From her earliest moments, the child is in a community of other people who can be relied upon to be there. The same people, day after day, who are reliably providing her with time, habits, and intimacy. And lastly, instruction. Well, a baby starts receiving instructions from her parents after just a few short months. Her mind is engaged early on. Okay, so time, habit, intimacy, community, and instruction. These are the 5 basic elements of a child's spiritual formation. Her ideas about herself and her world, identity, value, anthropology, power, purpose, and love, are formed primarily through relationships and experiences. These 6 core ideas form her heart, and they are formed through the 5 elements. Her 6 core ideas will stay with her for the rest of her life, unless various circumstances cause them to change, for better or for worse. So how does our spiritual formation occur as we age? If time, habit, intimacy, community, and instruction are the basis for a child's spiritual formation, what are the basic elements for our spiritual formation as adults? Well, time, habit, intimacy, community, and instruction. They're the same 5 elements. Let's take a look at how Jesus modeled discipleship, spiritual formation, through these same 5 elements. Time. How much time did Jesus spend with his close friends? Well, he lived with them. For 3 years, they ate and slept and talked and traveled together. They seemed to be together most of the time. Even after Pentecost, as disciples began to multiply, there's a strong sense that Christians lived, ate, and worked with each other. Acts 2 talks about the earliest Christians devoting themselves to the teaching, fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayer. They learned together, they ate together, they prayed together, and they lived together. Understanding that most people of that era didn't venture all that far from their home, their place of birth, we see a very different picture of the life of a disciple in that time frame, just by the amount of time they spent with one another. Even on their first few missionary journeys, the traveling folks would typically spend months, if not years, in one location, living with their apprentices and students, eating, working, talking, serving, doing life together. What about habits? What habits did Jesus model for his friends and disciples? Well, certainly teaching and prayer, sleep, food. It's striking just how often meals come up in the Bible. What else? Well, here we need to go a bit deeper into the Gospels. Let's look carefully at how Jesus interacted with people. Like we mentioned earlier, he seems disinterested in small talk or patronizing questions. Instead, he is incredibly quick at getting to the heart of the person he's interacting with. He's primarily interested in uncovering their ideas and desires and pointing them towards himself. Jesus is deeply, irresistibly concerned with the hearts of those around him. That's what he wants to talk about. He uncovers their pride, their arrogance, their legalism. He gently unveils their brokenness, their wounds, their fractures. Though he deals with the arrogant differently than the humble, his intention seems to be inviting them all under the surface, inviting them to explore their soil and roots, even when it hurts. And he meets them there. This is one of his habits, inviting those around him to drop their pretense and to experience Jesus as the fulfillment of their heart's true desires. Another habit? Restoration. Jesus is constantly healing, physically, but also spiritually and culturally. When he healed the woman who had the bleeding issue for many years, he didn't just heal her body. She was no longer ceremonially unclean. She was restored to her community. Jesus embraced children. In that era, children were typically throwaways, afterthoughts. But he hugged them, embraced them, blessed them, and he made the startling statement that adults couldn't enter the kingdom if we weren't like these little children. Jesus restored not only to physical health, but to restoration in all four of our relationships with God, self, others, and creation and culture. This was one of his habits. Intimacy. How did Jesus model intimacy with his disciples? Well, he was very careful to whom he gave his heart. He didn't treat everyone the same. He was most vulnerable with his inner circle of 3 friends, but he gave himself pretty freely to the 12 disciples. He shared his heart, his plans, his future, his pain. Though they fell asleep on him, a few of his disciples witnessed his extraordinary emotional suffering right before the cross. His 3 closest friends saw the transfiguration. Within his tight community, he was surprisingly transparent and open-hearted. With the Pharisees, not so much. The point is, he modeled a striking vulnerability to his closest friends. Community. As mentioned, the 12 disciples and the band of men and women who traveled with them were Jesus' closest community. They did life together. Discipleship happened relationally in a committed group of friends. After Pentecost, we see a similar pattern. Intentional communities springing up in tight-knit groups of families and close friends. And instruction. Well, this is what we typically think of as discipleship today, and Jesus certainly instructed. He instructed the masses differently than his close friends, and his instructions ended up turning the world upside down. So if our core ideas are initially formed through these 5 elements when we're very young, and Jesus modeled how ideas are transformed in the hearts of adults with the same 5 elements, perhaps we should look at our current reality to see if and how these 5 elements are found in our own lives. What role do time, habit, community, intimacy, and instruction play in the progressive formation of our ideas today? Well, how about our churches? Are you and I being spiritually formed in the current environment of the American church? Do our churches cultivate an environment where time, habit, intimacy, and community are intentionally thriving in cooperation with instruction? Our family goes to a nice church. It's growing quickly in terms of the number of people showing up to the services, and leadership seems very excited about that. It's a typical church in that it holds a weekly service, has a small group ministry, a few programs for people who are grieving or who are struggling with addiction. There's a great youth group and a thriving group of young adults, and they faithfully preach the word. But to put it bluntly, I don't expect to be discipled there. And frankly, I don't think the church expects to make disciples. A pastor is called to be a shepherd, but I've met the senior pastor one time. I don't think he even knows my name. It's not his fault. There are just far too many people in the congregation for him to get to know and personally shepherd. I assume that's the way he wants it. Like most growing larger churches, the idea of discipleship is basically outsourced to small groups. There's a fair amount of irony in that if we think about it. I suspect my experience is like a lot of people's, whether we go to large or smaller churches. What about those who don't go to church at all? Well, if society has boiled down the role of church to worship music, a compelling sermon, volunteerism, and fellowship with friends, the truth is many people don't need the church as it currently presents itself. They can listen to worship music on their phones. They can watch their favorite preacher on their iPad whenever they want. They can volunteer with their favorite cause and hang out with their friends at their convenience. The church leaders are quick to call out people who stop going to church and are quick to quote Hebrews 10:23-25. But perhaps we should look more inward than outward. Perhaps people, because we are spiritual creatures with desires, are longing for connection, are longing to be known, are longing for genuine discipleship. And perhaps we're discovering in general that's not what the Western church is cultivating. Are churches and denominations to blame? Well, perhaps in part, but before we take shots at institutions, we should look at ourselves and the culture we've created. Christian institutions, whether right or wrong, are somewhat beholden to what we give them. There are a large number of church leaders who agree that discipleship is much more than education, but simply do what they can, considering the frenetic, somewhat self-centered nature of the average American life. After all, we celebrate the American dream and rugged individualism, even though that individualism is essentially opposed to biblical discipleship. Well, I hope this little pit stop was helpful, and I hope you're looking forward to exploring the 6 core ideas and the 5 elements of formation as much as I am. We have a wonderful journey ahead of us. We'll spend a few more episodes getting grounded in the idea of discipleship as the transformation of ideas, and then we'll start answering a very important question. If the ideas in our hearts are mostly hidden, how can we uncover them? Next is episode 8, and it is fascinating as we break down this concept of an idea into its parts. We'll explore the anatomy of an idea. Hey, thanks for listening. If you'd like more information on Soil and Roots, check out the website at soilandroots.org. You can sign up for our email list there. Feel free, as always, to drop us an email at fish@soilandroots.org if you have a question or something you want to chat about. And we'll see you next time.